So I've been a fan of Ross Douthat for a long time. For those of you who don't know that name, Douthat is a columnist for the New York Times, where he writes both as a conservative but also as a committed Catholic. He's also written a number of books. In fact, one of the books that he wrote several years ago, called The Decadent Society, is a book that I still use to help me kind of make sense of and understand the world in which we live. So I was very excited when I heard that Douthat was writing a book defending religious belief. As a person who really appreciates apologetics and teaches apologetics, I was excited to read Douthat's perspective on this topic. And so I was eager to pick the book up. I'm excited to offer a brief review of the book here. The book comes at an interesting time where many people are observing that across society, just kind of generally, religious belief is being regarded more positively than it has been in recent years. There's stories of prominent atheists like Larry Sanger, Aaron Hirsi Ali, actually converting and becoming followers of Jesus. There's well-known agnostics, people like Jonathan Haidt, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, who are speaking affirmatively about the value of religious belief, both in individual lives and in society in general. So it seems as if there's this thaw that's happening, a very hopeful thaw that's happening towards religious belief in society, especially amongst those people that I'm sure Douthat was imagining as he's writing this book. People who tend to be well-educated, tend to be regard themselves as maybe too sophisticated for religious belief. In other words, the type of people that you would think would read his columns in the New York Times. And I think that's really who he was writing his book to. He was writing his book to these secular people who have never really given religion or religious belief much consideration or much thought. And Douthat is writing this book, pleading with them, asking them to at least consider the possibility of religious belief, to take that first step. Now, this is not a book, and I think this is one of the things I appreciated about it. This is not a book that's arguing believe in God, practice a religion because it's somehow psychologically healthy for you, or it's going to be good for your family, or it's going to be good for maybe for society. The more people believe, the better off we'll be. That's not really his focus in the book. His focus in the book is we should consider religious belief because religious belief makes the best sense of what we observe in the world around us. In other words, we should consider religious belief because religious belief is actually telling the truth. And so he really makes the case in the first 3 chapters of the book. He's making his case for religious belief, and in some respects, it reminded me a little bit of David Bentley Hart's book that he wrote a number of years ago called The Experience of God. Now, David Bentley Hart has a very dense style, very difficult to read. Douthat's book is not that. Douthat's book is very easy to read, very accessible in that way. But David Bentley Hart, he made a 3-part argument for the existence of God that he just labeled being, consciousness, and bliss. In other words, the belief in God makes sense because, after all, God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe, the existence of all things. God is also the best explanation for the fact that we are conscious beings with minds. And God is also the best explanation for the fact that we pursue aesthetic pleasure, beauty, bliss is what he calls it. Douthat's argument is similar in some respects, but also different. So in the first 3 chapters, he first argues that belief in God makes sense because of the nature of the world around us. In other places, this might be called the argument from design, or the argument from fine tuning. This is the type of argument that you read in a lot of apologetics books, that basically it makes sense to believe in God because when you look at the world around us, it seems like it was designed and set up for life. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter, he talks about the existence of the mind and the existence of human consciousness. And this has become one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God, which is that it's hard to understand, it's hard to make sense of the existence of the mind unless there is a God who created us uniquely with consciousness, with minds. And so he really goes into depth in that argument in chapter 2, and arguing, among other things, that all our advances in science, all our advances in like neurobiology, haven't really solved the fundamental question of the mind. They've given us a better understanding, perhaps, of how the brain works, but they haven't explained sufficiently where consciousness comes from, or even what consciousness is. And then his third chapter, I really liked his third chapter, because in his third chapter, he talks about the existence of spiritual phenomenon and spiritual experiences, that when you look at the experiences that people have, whether it's the miraculous or just unexplained spiritual phenomenon in their life, that it's hard just to dismiss the testimony of millions of people who are continuing in our very modern, sophisticated age. They're continuing to have these spiritual experiences. And I was so glad to see this chapter, because this is something that's neglected in a lot of apologetics books. A lot of apologetics books don't take seriously the phenomenon of spiritual experiences as an argument for the existence of God. And I think they do that to their detriment, because the reality is many people are having these spiritual experiences, and these spiritual experiences don't have a great explanation unless there is in fact a God. And so that's really the core of his argument in the first half of the book is we should be willing to take the first step in religious belief, because religious belief makes the best sense of the world around us. Now, as you get into the second half of the book, a lot of readers might have some concerns as they get into the second half, because it seems as if at times Douthat is arguing for a very sort of generic religious belief. Perhaps even a relativistic sort of religious belief, where, the specific content of your belief doesn't matter, as long as you believe in God, or as long as you believe in something, then that's sufficient as a first step. And to be fair, it does seem as if he makes that case at various times. But if you read carefully, Douthat he's not arguing for relativism here. He explicitly argues against universalism in the book. I think what he's really arguing is that there's elements of truth, lowercase t, there's elements of truth to be found in various different religious traditions. And he actually argues that as we are considering religious belief, we should actually lean into the more established, more traditional religions in the world. But he's saying I think he's arguing there are lowercase t truths in various religious traditions. And so what's important for us is to be willing to take that first step towards belief, to kind of get off the sidelines and consider religious belief. And I think it's important to remember, I think, who his target audience is. His target audience is, what we would think of, sort of stereotypically secular people who haven't even considered the possibility that religious belief is true or valuable or whatever. And so I think he's trying to argue that we need to consider at least taking the first step towards belief. Now, the last chapter in the book is Douthat's own argument for the truth of Christianity. So he does get to that point where he argues that he actually calls himself, he says, when I say the Nicene Creed, I mean it. So he is a true and authentic believer, and he makes his case for Jesus. He makes his case for Christianity, specifically Catholic Christianity, in the last chapter of the book. Now, I think he could have developed this further. I think there are certainly additional arguments that I would have made in this last chapter, specifically in regards to arguing for the truth of the gospel, specifically the truth of the resurrection. So I would have liked to have seen this last chapter developed a little bit more. But he's essentially giving his own testimony and his own brief apologetic for why he is a Christian. And he ends the book with a call to commitment, that these things are serious. And because these things are serious, they demand from us a serious response. Overall, I thought it was a good book. I should confess that I was a little bit disappointed. I was hoping for a little bit more. But Douthat did write a very accessible book, arguing for the value of taking that first step towards religious belief. But ultimately, I think there are other books that I'm still going to recommend before this book to the seekers and the skeptics in my life. For instance, I really like Gavin Ortlund's book, Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. Really like that book. Really like Timothy Keller's book, The Reason for God. I still will lean more towards those books than I will towards Ross Douthat's book. But I think given his voice and given his audience that he's writing to, an audience that's not very likely to pick up a Gavin Ortlund book or maybe even a Timothy Keller book, I think to that extent he did accomplish what he set out to accomplish, which was to argue that we should be willing to take the first step towards belief, because belief makes the best sense out of what we observe in the world.